I never want to see anything like this for Barbados. We aren't built to handle that. I mean, you see the devastation around you, and it could have been much worse if there weren't any mountains, to be honest, actually helping with the wind shear. The landslides alone are catastrophic. And those wind speeds, nothing here stood up to it, nothing. There's no building that wasn't left damaged in some major way, and you'll see it. It's almost like, sorry to make this comparison, driving through Port-au-Prince after that earthquake.
Every year, when the month of June arrives, we air the usual promos on hurricane shelters, hurricane supplies that you should store up, and key weather terms. But after the devastating effects of the 2017 hurricane season, we at the Barbados Government Information Service and the Department of Emergency Management became very concerned that many of us are not equipped or ready to handle a serious hurricane. So in this feature, we're going to focus on an area that could save your life: how to purify water and the amount of water you should store in the event of a disaster.
An ample supply of clean water, Lisa, is absolutely essential for survival, particularly in the event of a hurricane or a disaster or any major emergency. Your ability to have water to drink for the purposes of sanitation and for personal hygiene, water is an absolute essential in order for survival, even if we consider only those three parameters. For each individual person, you should have 1 gallon of water. That 1 gallon basically would be like a half gallon for drinking, and the other half gallon would be for basic personal hygiene. And that is the minimum that you should try to aim for when you're preparing for a disaster. 1 gallon per person. The ideal storage would be 3 gallons per person to cover, because the time that we really aim for is to have enough for 3 days minimum. And of course you have to think about how realistic it is to store certain amounts of water per person. So we really aim for 1 gallon per person per day for 3 days. That's normally the minimum that we would encourage people to aim for. Pregnant women, for instance, would need more water than the average person. People that are sick, and of course breastfeeding mothers, would need a little more than that. So in a case like that, special cases, we would recommend really 1.5 to 2 gallons of water per person. If we consider the uses that I spoke of, under these circumstances, you'll be able to appreciate that you can't take your typical shower and you can't do the normal things that we Barbadians would like to do. So when we're talking about half a gallon for personal hygiene and things like that, we're really speaking about sponge baths and those types of things, and basic hand washing. Those are the personal hygiene measures that you would normally undertake in that emergency situation.
Environmental health specialist Steve Daniel also explained the difference between water for sanitation and water for sanitizing.
So you would have water for cooking, you would have water for sanitation, and when we say sanitation, we mean flushing of toilets, we mean washing down and keeping certain surfaces clean. We also mean cleaning and cooking surfaces. So when you think about drinking water, water should be potable for drinking. It should also be potable for washing of food items, vegetables, fruits, things like that, and washing of the utensils that you'll be using for cooking. When we say sanitizing, we really mean making things clean, and that normally is reference to things that will go into your mouth. So we're talking about cooking utensils, the formites you use for eating. We're talking about plates, cups, that kind of things. So you need to be using potable water for that. The water that you would drink, the standard of that, the sanitizing water should be of that same quality as well. As it relates to sanitation, we're talking about the removal of liquid waste. So the flushing of toilets, you would need to be able to access some level of water if that is the means by which you're going to be disposing of waste. And that water does not need to be potable water.
And what about the rainwater that is collected in water storage tanks? How can that be utilized?
In fact, that rainwater could be very important because of course you want to conserve your drinking water for as long as possible. And that rainwater can be used for the flushing of toilets. If you want to wash down surfaces on the floors or any non-food surface, that rainwater can be used for the washing of things like that that are not used for basically creating food and stuff like that. In an absolute emergency, worst case scenario, you may need to consider if all access to drinking water has disappeared and there's really no access to drinking water, you will then, if you do have rainwater stored, you will have to then consider disinfecting it for other purposes.
The easiest way to purify water is to boil it, but chlorination can also be used.
If the water is discolored or it contains suspended particles, we would advocate that you filter it first and boil it. By boiling, we mean you bring it to a rolling boil when everything is basically bubbling up, and you allow that to boil like that for at least a minute. And that is the main way that we encourage people to treat water for drinking purposes. Outside of that, you can add chlorine disinfectant, which is basically household bleach, and we emphasize the non-scented chlorine bleach. If you have a water source that is contaminated with chemicals, it cannot be purified by boiling, unfortunately. So any water source that you suspect may be contaminated by any chemical contaminant, it should be avoided at all costs because you really don't know what is present in it. And as a matter of fact, sometimes boiling it can concentrate certain contaminants and make the situation even worse.
Your disaster kit should always include chemical sanitizing agents to minimize the use of water and to also support sanitation efforts in the event of a disaster.
If you can get chlorine tablets for water purification tablets, that would be ideal. But in the absence of that, chlorine disinfectant is very important for all other purposes relating to basic hygiene and sanitizing and making sure your environment is clean and safe.
Now Mr. Daniel demonstrates what should be considered when storing water. It begins with a safe storage container.
What we have here would be a 5-gallon, the typical 5-gallon bucket. What's important, it has a sealable cover. And the other things that you need as well would be these measuring devices that you will need to apply your disinfectant. These are articles that should be easily accessible. The syringe, you should be able to acquire this at any pharmacy with the measurements in milliliters, or you can get your suite of teaspoons to tablespoon. And what we would have in every household, a typical teaspoon, but because of the size, some persons refer to it as a tablespoon. But using the measurements that are available, this would classify as a teaspoon. As it relates to the storage container itself, you want to make sure it is sealable, as I said before. And by that, you can see that it has a good tight seal. It has to be without any damages or cracks. And of course, before you store water in this, you have to sanitize it completely using the same chlorine disinfectant. The reason we emphasize chlorine disinfectant is that chlorine has properties that we refer to as residual properties, meaning that for the period of time that you've applied it, it remains an effective disinfectant for a long period of time after it has been applied. As long as nothing contaminates the water, it still has disinfecting potential. So, for instance, if you have 1 gallon of water, you will need a half a milliliter of 5% chlorine bleach. What do I mean by 5%? You will look at the container and it should have the active ingredient sodium hypochlorite, and it should say 5 or 6% sodium hypochlorite on the typical chlorine disinfecting bottle. For 1 gallon of water to be purified, you would use a half a milliliter of your chlorine disinfecting bleach. And you measure that half a milliliter by the curvature, wherever the curvature in the syringe is, you make that measurement based on the curvature and not on the line itself. So this would be half a milliliter of chlorine bleach to be applied to 1 gallon of water. If you have a 5-gallon container, as we do here, you would need then to fill this to 2.5 milliliters of chlorine bleach to purify 5 gallons of water. When you apply your chlorine bleach to the water, you let it sit for at least 30 minutes before it's ready to use. And remember, before you store water for potable purposes, this container should be cleaned thoroughly inside and out with a chlorine disinfecting agent. And when it is filled, it must snap back tightly, completely around, so that nothing can get in or out. And you store your water in a dry, dark environment to get as much storage potential out of it, remaining as clean and as safe as possible for a long period of time.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, hello.
So glad I saw you. Persons have been calling, and I just have a question. Exactly how much water does a family of 3 need for 3 days?
Well, what we're looking at here is actually a gallon bottle of water. And to make it simple, 1 gallon like this supports 1 person for 1 day.
So 1 gallon for 1 person?
Yes, because we expect you to use half of this for drinking and the other half for very basic sanitation.
Okay.
If we look at the other size we have here, which is about 5 liters, and if you do the conversion, if it's like 3.7 liters per gallon, this is a little more than what the minimum for 1 person. However, a person that is ill or a pregnant person, this would be very suitable for her because they would need a little more than 1 gallon per day to assist them to get through for every single day. So one of these, according to how you are, for 1 day.
Yeah.
So a family of 3, we're talking 3 gallons per day. For 3 days, so we're speaking about 9 gallons for an average family of 3.
So I need 9 of these bottles for 3 days for my family of 3?
Yes, definitely, and that is a minimum.
Okay, thanks so much, Steve.
You're welcome.
See you.
All right.
He points out that the choice of storage container for water is very important. Here's why.
When looking for a container to store water in, these are ideal simply because they were made and manufactured for the storage of water. This container, for instance, is a 4.5 gallon capacity, and this would be ideal for 1 person for 4 days. So if you look at it that way and you're thinking about 4 days of storage, just 1 day over 3 days, each family member having this amount of water for themselves would be absolutely ideal. That is important in that there are other containers that, for instance, the large 55-gallon containers, drums, though they may hold a lot of water, they may not be ideal for the storage of drinking water, simply because the chemicals that they may have been holding in them are toxic and may be imparted into the material itself, and it would be very difficult to remove it. That then can be a source of contamination of the water if you store water for drinking purposes in them. Though it can be useful for sanitizing and sanitation to some extent, it would not be ideal for drinking water if you're not sure on the type of container, the type of constituents that were in these containers.
So remember to store at least 1 gallon of water per person per day for at least 3 days. But don't forget, you'll also need water for sanitation purposes. Be ready. Be hurricane ready.